his project, so sorry.
Silence. Well, it's great to have you here. This semester, or this year, we have looked at this scripture passage, and in light of this question of the early believers wondering, just what is it that God expects? And God says, I've told you over and over and over through the prophet Micah, and reminds them, reminds them that at the bottom there that He's shown you what's good, to just act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. And throughout the year, we've looked at various ways in which believers have attempted to do that, or completely ignored it, or reinterpreted by their own means of what suits at the time. And today we're going to look at a different brand of thinking, and that is contemplative silence, which has been far removed from certainly the Protestant faith for many years. It was a sort of a knee-jerk reaction from the Roman Catholic way of being much more contemplative and observational in worship. And so the Protestants were much more about, let's get in and do work and be busy and form committees and put some structure into this thing. And so contemplation sort of moved to the back. But it has had a resurgence in the late 20th century, early 21st. We're hearing a recording of nuns from Missouri, and this is from Lent at Ephesus, one of their CDs. It's #1 on the Billboard charts of all styles of music. It has been for weeks and weeks. Their Advent one was all through Christmas. They have dominated the charts. So what does that say? It also says to me that nobody's getting this in church. So is it something that they don't find in their own church but seek? Is it the concept of somebody else doing it for you and you don't have to participate, which is not the liturgy or work of the people? So it brings up a couple of questions, which is what we enjoy about this time. Our guest speakers today will throw out some things, and you will have a chance to put them all together in light of the scripture. Before they begin, I want to play you just another CD, and this is from the Taizé community in the Burgundy region of France. This style seeks contemplation, but participatory contemplation. And this is one of their most popular pieces. Jesus, remember me, it's just repeated over and over until you sort of go into a little daze. Of course, first we're having this talking. There you go. It's very simple melody, it can be harmonized, and the words are only, Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom. From the singing nuns, because this requires everyone to take part. So it is work of the people, or liturgy, but yet still can have that contemplation. And that's a new thing in the Christian church at this time. And so if you look up Taizé online, you'll have 1,000 of these sort of choices. You'll learn more about the community. About 10 years ago, we hosted 2 brothers from the community on campus and did worship in the gym with a multitude of churches from the community. It was a wonderful experience. But the entire service of worship is this repeated singing and the listening of Scripture, listening to Scripture. Today, we're going to hear about contemplative, well, I'm just making up contemplative silence. We're going to hear about plain silence if I'll stop talking. And then after that, sacred in space. So would you join me in welcoming Steve and Emmanuel?
You just can't say enough about stuff.
Yeah, I know.
No need to. All right. Well, I'm just going to get right to it because we're a little short on time in the space that we have. There are many ways to talk about silence and many ways to talk about spirituality and many ways to talk about how they intersect with each other. And I'm going to take a couple of whacks here from a couple of different directions and we'll see what sticks. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about music, actually, and the sounds of silence, And to do that, I'm going to say a few things about the American avant-garde composer, John Cage, who had a lot to say about sound and silence. In 1951, he visited Harvard University. They had on campus there, they had built something called an anechoic chamber, what we would normally think of as a soundproof room. And he was fascinated by the idea of experiencing silence in a soundproof room. But when he went in and sat in that room, he had a momentous discovery. And that was, well, as he expressed it here in the quotation, there's no such thing as silence. Something is always happening that makes a sound. He heard two things when he was sitting in that chamber. One was a high-pitched tone, which he found out afterwards was the sound of his nervous system. And he heard a lower-pitched tone, which he found out afterwards was the sound of the blood circulating through his body. And so this insight that he had at the time, that silence, as we usually think about it, the absence of sound, really doesn't exist. Silence is something else, something that always has some activity of sound going on in it, became important for his whole approach to composing music and thinking about what music is. And the following year, in 1952, he composed this piece, his most famous piece, I think, called 4 minutes, 33 seconds, which some people call 4 minutes, 33 seconds of silence. Because here's what happens. The performer comes out, in this case a pianist, you have an image of somebody doing this, sits at the piano, shuffles the paper around, starts a timer, and then closes the lid on the piano and just sits. There are 3 movements to this. Not that it really matters that much. But what's going on here is that the piece consists of all the sounds that occur in the performance space while the musicians are not playing. And it almost sounds like a gimmick, except that what he's trying to do is to draw your attention to the fact that you're trying to focus very narrowly on what you think is the most important thing, what you think is the music. But sound happens on a continuum. It's all around us all the time. The guy who's coughing in the front row, or the lady who's opening the cough drop and making that noise with the crinkly paper for 4 minutes, they usually find as annoying or as not music and something that shouldn't be happening is just part of the experience of sound and the experience of music. This just transformed the way Cage approached the whole idea of composing music and introducing people to music and celebrating sound. He wanted music to be a liberating experience, one that opens the mind to the endless possibilities of sound and silence. And much of his thinking actually was shaped by an encounter that he had, now getting to the spiritual dimension of this, with a very influential teacher of Zen Buddhism who was at Columbia University in the 40s, named D.T. Suzuki. And Cage writes here, since the 40s and through the study with D.T. Suzuki of the philosophy of Zen Buddhism, I've thought of music as a means of changing the mind. I saw art not as something that consisted of a communication from the artist to an audience, but rather as an activity of sound, in which the artist found a way to let the sounds be themselves, and in being themselves to open the minds of people to other possibilities than they had previously considered. And so there are a few images here in the right. He's sitting with his teacher, D.T. Suzuki. Here he's in Kyoto, Japan, visiting a monastery where he went, and he may even be meditating right here, for all we know. And up top there he's getting his bell rung. The theme, of course, is to get yourself out of whatever cage you find yourself in. That's the theme of Zen that he's bringing to music. Zen aims at liberating the mind from the biases and the preconceptions, the cages, so to speak, that prevent us from experiencing the reality of the present moment. In Zen Buddhism, of course, this is accomplished through the practice of meditation. This is a state of non-judgmental awareness in which the mind moves freely and spontaneously with whatever it happens to be unfolding in that moment. That is to say, without that constructing activity of the ego that imposes its ideas, its feelings, its attitudes, its values, or its meanings on that experience. In other words, just trying to be present to whatever it is, to experience the reality of that. So the judgments of the ego are a kind of noise that's generated by the mind. When I'm talking about it, sometimes I use this example. You have to excuse the example. It's a little bit jarring for some people, but there's a point to it. If I were to say to you, for example, 5 seconds from now, a prostitute will walk through this door. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Could you imagine somebody coming through the door? When I used the word, did you have a picture that immediately came to your mind of who that person would be or how that person would look? Very often people immediately think that it would be maybe a woman, although I never said anything about the gender of the person, where they imagine that that person would be dressed in a certain way, that that person would talk in a certain way. Of course, this is somebody you haven't even met yet or seen, and yet this filter that goes along with all the ideas and associations and judgments and biases and prejudices that you have about that are always there, and are always filtering the way that we experience things. This is the Zen idea, right? So in order to get to reality and be connected to reality, you have to kind of circumvent that filter that creates so much bias and prejudice. Now, Cage's music creates opportunities for the listener to be fully present to the experience of music, of sound, and it does this by introducing elements of chance and spontaneity, right? It's not scripted. So 4:33, that 4 minutes, 33 seconds of somebody sitting there doing nothing, gives you the opportunity to experience the activity of sound that's all around you. And there's something about that dynamic activity. It's never the same, right? You can't predict it like if you've heard Beethoven's Fifth 50 times, and you go and you know what's coming next, and you're just sitting there in anticipation, right? But if you don't know what's coming next, because it's going to be totally spontaneous, it has this tendency to make you focus on that present moment, on just what's happening right there. And that's the sort of thing that Cage, as an artist, was trying to do for his listeners. He might think of that as a kind of gift to his listeners. Here's an image of somebody who's doing another one of his compositions. This is playing cactuses. He also used unusual sounds that kind of set people off balance. And this music consists of somebody plucking the spines of the cactuses either with a fingernail or with a toothpick. And his point here, I just put this little quotation underneath it, if you develop an ear for sounds that are musical, it's like developing an ego. You begin to refuse sounds that are not musical, and that way cut yourself off from a good deal of experience. So again, it's this theme of your preconceptions of what music is supposed to be that actually rob you of being present to the reality of that sound and enjoying that sound. In a late interview, he made a statement that I thought was particularly beautiful, and it sounded poetic, so I put it in the form of a poem here, the very cagey thing to do, where he said, I love sounds, just as they are, and I have no need for them to be anything more. I don't want sound to be psychological. I don't want a sound to pretend that it's the bucket, or that it's a president, or that it's in love with another sound. I just want it to be a sound. And in that very same interview, he made this observation, which is going to be the transitional point to moving into talking more formally about spirituality, where he said, the sound experience which I prefer to all others is the experience of silence. And this silence, almost everywhere in the world now, is traffic. Now, the idea here, of course, being that most people live in cities. That's where the densest populations are. And in those areas, everybody is familiar with the soundtrack of traffic, which is the soundtrack of our lives. He was fascinated by the sound. When he gave this interview, he was sitting by a window overlooking 6th Avenue in Manhattan. and you could hear the traffic in the background. And he was talking about how much he enjoyed just sitting there and listening to that dynamic unfolding of different sounds, trucks passing by, taxi cabs beeping, all of the various noises that go along with it. It's sort of a symphony, if you think about it that way, or if you're open to experiencing it that way. And it's very liberating just to sit and let that experience unfold. He went on to say, if you listen to Beethoven, it's always the same. But if you listen to traffic, it's always different. Now, traffic is that might be hard for you to connect to. Traffic is usually something you associate negative ideas with. But I thought of the example of rain. Some of the most blessed moments I've ever experienced have been, I remember being on my aunt's farm down in Asheville, North Carolina, and sitting on a screened-in back porch in the evening when the rain was falling. And just sitting there and just letting my mind just follow the rain. Totally unpredictable, constantly changing, increasing in volume, decreasing, getting faster, getting slower, all the different kinds of drips and drops and flows and so on and so forth. And at that moment, I'm not thinking about taxes, and I'm not thinking about my bills, and I'm not thinking about things that happened yesterday, and I'm not worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. I'm just there, present in that moment, and I'm free. And this is the sort of thing that Cage was after, that experience of just being liberated in the presence of sound. Now, let me see if I can make a quick segue here now and talk a little bit and see if you can see some of the parallels here to a discussion about inner silence and spiritual practice. Here are some images of people from many of great world religions. You notice they're all engaged in some kind of contemplative activity, some kind of meditative activity. There are examples here from Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism, Christianity, Sufism, and so forth. All of these people are doing the same sort of thing. They're trying to create an interior silence. An interior silence that will allow them to be directly present to some greater reality, the idea of the ultimate, or maybe God. All of these people are doing a very similar kind of thing, which I've actually previewed by talking about John Cage. They're trying to create that immediate presence to what is there. But they're doing it specifically by trying to get themselves out of the way, trying to get that ego out of the way, right? That constant chatter in the mind that's always judging, thinking, analyzing, right? And getting in the way of actually experiencing the reality of what's around. And for people in these traditions, that's a spiritual reality, right? That's God unfolding in the world around them, or that's touching the nature of the ultimate, or it's just being present to the real, or however they describe those things in the various religious traditions that they participate in. So by creating that internal silence through their meditative or contemplative practice, they're trying to create the conditions for that direct awareness. And again, it's about trying to move the ego out of the way, to allow whatever is there that's real to reveal itself to them. And these activities they describe in various ways. Sometimes they talk of it as calming the mind, emptying oneself, centering, opening. But all of these activities have one thing in common. They involve focusing the mind in a particular way. And they use various kinds of objects for this focus. So in many religious traditions, simply using the breath. This is very common, for example, Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism. It's common to Sufism and even in contemporary Sikhism. And it's even sort of making its way a little bit into Christian practices. And this is just the simple activity of focusing on the in-breath and the out-breath. It's not because the breath is that important, but just focusing the mind in that one place and following that allows the mind to relax. It lets go of the past, it lets go of the future, and it's right there, ready to be present to your, depending on the tradition you're in, the experience of ultimate reality or the experience of God. Sometimes it's a word. In the Christian tradition, there's a very old tradition that goes back to the 14th century, and a text called the Cloud of Unknowing. And there are practices like centering prayer and things like that that involve using maybe a particular word, a sacred word. You could just use the name of Jesus. Just sitting with that word, repeating that word quietly over and over, focusing the mind, creating a stillness that opens up the possibility of being present to the divine reality. A mantra, just maybe a longer sentence or phrase or something that serves the same sort of purpose. Sometimes it's a visualization. There's a wonderful text by St. Ignatius Loyola that advises practitioners to choose a passage from the Bible that contains a scene. It might be a scene at the crucifixion, for example. And what you do is in your imagination, you put yourself at that scene. You put yourself at the foot of the cross. And you're smelling the smells, and you're fully aware in a three-dimensional way of what's unfolding there. And that keeps you really focused on that. And again, it takes the mind out of the past. You're not thinking about taxes and other things. You're not worried about the future. But you're right there in that moment. It also helps in the cultivation of certain emotions that, and feelings and character traits that are important to the Christian tradition, like humility. Chanting is another. I think we heard an example of that earlier. The Gregorians, of course, are very famous for their meditative chants, and we find chants in almost every tradition. In Sikhism, when I was in India a couple of summers ago, I experienced a ceremony in which the Sikhs typically chant the name of God, Waheguru. In their tradition, they just chant that over and over and over as a form of meditation. And of course, prayer. And you can tell by these last two examples here that interior silence, again, is not the absence of sound necessarily, right? Sound can be part of that experience. It's the stillness that's being created in the process that's the important thing. In connection with prayer, I just wanted to reference a couple of people who really stand out for me in terms of their understanding of contemplative prayer. One is the Christian theologian, Protestant, Lutheran theologian Kierkegaard, who regarded inner silence as essential to the Christian spiritual life. He notes that people who don't know how to be silent live in a state of constant distraction, as he puts it, hundreds of thousands of miles ahead of themselves, in feelings, in delusions, in intentions, in resolutions, in wishes, in longings. Joy, though, is possible only when we've freed ourselves from the worries, from the fears that bind us to the world and to separate us from God in that present moment. And here he's essentially riffing on some passage in the New Testament, particularly from Matthew, where he's talking about the lilies and the birds, and talking about putting away earthly cares and the simplicity of silence and just being present to God, which was, I think, Kierkegaard's most favorite of all New Testament passages. As a spiritual exercise, contemplative prayer involves letting go of the earthly cares, earthly concerns that keep us wrapped up in ourselves, that feed our ego. Those are all about us and thinking about ourselves as opposed to thinking about God or being present to God or putting our trust and faith in God. So the task is to clear away all those distractions so that, as Kierkegaard puts it, we might forget ourselves in loving devotion to God. Kierkegaard observes that to pray the right way, you shall make yourself nothing, become nothing before God. This emptying of the ego is, he says, the beginning of all true prayer. And I have a quotation here where he's describing somebody who has this ardent wish to make himself clear to God. He just wants God to understand him. So he starts praying as the Bible describes this, with all his heart and all his might, all his soul, right? And then Kierkegaard goes on, and gradually, as he became more and more fervent in prayer, he had less and less to say. Finally, he became completely silent. He became silent. Indeed, he became what is possible, even more opposite to speaking in silence. He became a listener. He thought that to pray is to speak. He learned that to pray is not only to be silent, but is to listen. This silence you can learn with the lily and the bird. When you become silent like the lily and the bird, you are at the beginning, which is to seek first God's kingdom. That's from a discourse that he wrote entitled The Lily in the Field and the Bird in the Air. This idea is echoed in the work of the great Catholic contemplative of the 20th century, Thomas Merton, who wrote, "Contemplation is essentially a listening in silence. A higher kind of listening, which is a general emptiness that waits to realize the fullness of the message of God," and so forth. But you get the very same idea that it's about the contemplative process, about emptying out the ego, about trying to be fully present to the reality of the divine. It's not something you expect, it's not something you anticipate, it's something that you just prepare yourself to be ready to experience if God chooses to reveal the divine nature to you here in time. Now, of course, cultivating inner silence doesn't have to be about achieving some mystical divine unity with Godhead or any deity. It doesn't have to be about experiencing a grand enlightenment. Some people engage in contemplative practice just for having an enhanced sense of well-being, improving their health, or just for experiencing life more deeply. And our meditation can be as simple as listening to the sound of rain, or mindfully drinking a cup of tea, or sitting in the garden, walking on a woodland trail, or whatever happens to help you to experience the peace and the happiness that are available in the present moment. Whatever your motivation, the contemplative practice requires that you carve out some time. You have to learn how to unplug a little bit every day. That means turning off the computer, the TV, putting away the cell phone. And this, of course, can be extremely challenging. So from a contemplative perspective, spirituality is a very challenging thing in the digital age where people are so connected to their devices. And many people find that they're so conditioned by that constant stimulation that they just find it really hard to unplug. And when they do, the experience of silence can be jarring. It can be unfamiliar. It can be awkward. It can feel uncomfortable at first. And so it's something that takes a little bit of time to grow into. Now, to conclude, I'll just make this observation that there are people, I don't know how many of them there are, but I know they're out there because I talk to them occasionally, who they just find that they're not very attracted to the idea of a contemplative silence because they find it, dare I say it, this word, boring. And so for people who find it, if you find yourself in that particular category, then I'll conclude here by sharing a little bit of practical advice that John Cage wanted to offer people, and it goes something like this. If something's boring after 2 minutes, try it for 4. If still boring, then 8, then 16, then 32. Eventually, one discovers that it's not boring at all. Thank you.
We'll make a switch now. John Rudel will share with us.
John Cage had a very famous list of 10 instructions for teachers and students. I think first on that list was choose somebody intelligent to follow and then follow that person. So I'm very glad to be following Steve and Emmanuel in speaking here. I am here to speak about notions of sacred in space and imagery design. We came up with that title, or I did, because of some ambiguity associated with it. Notion is a general understanding, vague or imperfect conception or idea of something. So I'd like to fill some room there. Sacred, reverently dedicated to some person, purpose, or object. I'm kind of trying to think of the context of why am I speaking about this. I am a visual artist, and so I was trying to find a good definition for artist, and this would seem to be the best one. Person devoted or proficient at something. And then creativity would be that which I am devoted to, I guess, and I think essentially inside of that definition is a desire to make meaning in some way. So as an artist, I'm a person devoted to making meaning in some way. And then I started thinking about how do you organize space, if that's part of it, and so this kind of, if you've seen my office, this is a pretty good representation of my practice of design, at least in my sacred area. And then I found that I'm not alone. And I was able to find images of the death. There's Einstein, there's Mark Twain, and Steve Jobs. So my practice is similar to theirs. And I started thinking, what's that all about? And physicists have a term for it, I believe. And it's a tendency for systems to move from order to disorder. And then this is a better way of saying it in relation to physics. So I seem to be a vehicle for entropy. And so here's my desk. So I started to look into what does your messy desk say about you? Apparently disorderly environments, this is a study out of the University of Minnesota, disorderly environments seem to inspire breaking free of tradition and can produce fresh insights. Implications of these findings are practical in that if you need to think outside the box, you might let the clutter rise and unfetter your imagination. But if your primary goal is to eat well or go to the gym, pick up around the office first. That's at the bottom. So I think that the entropy is not an ongoing thing for me. It's part of the process, and I'm almost I refuse to clean up in the middle of a project. But I'll clean up at the end. But it's unlucky to clean up in the middle of a project. I've always thought. So entropy is okay with me because I feel like it's a closed system. However, the application or the idea can take on a much worse connotation if you think about it in a bigger notion in terms of physics. So I was trying to think of how sacred relates to that entropy. And so I thought, how would an artist respond to this notion of kind of continual discomfort until destruction? And I thought immediately of Thomas Kincaid. And so sacred space becomes, home and warmth. And Thomas Kincaid famously refers to himself as a painter of light. And I one time saw he was positioning for a major museum retrospective, and the reviewer in the New York Times referred to it as the kind of light you might imagine if you had not been outside in a very long time. But so over 10 years ago, when he was at the height of his career, in Vallejo, California, they were building a subdivision, and the slogan was after this, the painter of light, calm, not chaos, peace, not pressure. That's the notions. That would be sacred, right? And this at the bottom there, of course, right before it got slammed by the housing crisis and became the largest U.S. city to file, one of the largest U.S. cities to file for bankruptcy. And so, but this notion of sacred and I think I piggyback on some of what Dr. Emmanuel was referring to here. from a book by Joseph Campbell, Power of Myth, and the great interviews. If you ever have a chance to hear those interviews between Bill Moyer and Joseph Campbell, it's just really pretty inspiring. What's the book and the video series? But this notion of dedicating a space or an hour or a practice he said, don't think about the newspaper, don't think about who your friends are, don't think about anything, just contemplate and bring forth what you are and what you might be. And this would be another ideal place for creative incubation. Campbell also proposed the idea that myths from all over the world seem to be built from the same elementary ideas, and Carl Jung referred to these ideas as archetypes. Jungian archetypes play out in movies and television, familiar to us all. And for me, the bottom line there, the Star Wars archetypes are maybe the most fun. Campbell, most notably, George Lucas gives credit to Joseph Campbell for the ability to complete and write Star Wars. So Joseph Campbell, Star Wars, great there. One mythical archetypal configuration Campbell outlined in his book here with 1,000 Faces was the common structure of two worlds. And that's how we understand these things, sacred and mundane, heaven and hell. That structure of having this kind of binary relationship helps us understand maybe how we think about sacred. Artists are good at bringing these two worlds together, I think. These are some paintings that have been making their way around lately where it says interjected Star Wars in with Thomas Kincaid, and some people find this image terribly satisfying for some reason. But the archetype, that's kind of where I was going to think about making meaning and how do artists use the kind of history of thought in Western culture as a basis for making meaning. This is the Pantheon in Rome, and it is one of the most significant, famous architectural archetypes that you might consider. It's significant because it was a feat in Roman engineering. It's a display of sacred geometry and cosmography. It also was a statement of political imperium and Roman stability. As an archetype, good Virginians will recognize the barrel structure, the domed roof, and the square porch and triangular portico as a favorite design structure for buildings throughout the country. But I thought the most significant element that I could focus on to get where I wanted to go in terms of sacred, in terms of space and imagery design was the oculus, and that great hole in the ceiling. Cassius, this quote here mentions how it resembles the heaven itself. The building also has recesses for 7 altars, which at that time the time of its construction, there were 7 known planets. And the light of the sun tends to travel around the building, making it kind of a reverse sundial. And so the oculus is a really interesting, really simple. That's one of the things I like, good art. When things are just simplified down to this kind of basic, understandable symbolism, that works for me. So the oculus becomes, it's an archetype. It's used in many different ways. One of the most interesting or terrible ways it was ever used was to refer to the eye of God in the Eastern State Penitentiary. This is a very famous, again, archetypal, architectural American invention. The idea for this, Benjamin Franklin doesn't always get this one when you hear about him, but the penitentiary was an idea that grew out of meetings at his house and of the Enlightenment ideals of the early United States, that the Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons decided, instead of this kind of just punishment, the stories of prisons prior to this is totally horrific. And yes,
Is that Virginia?
that's in the state of Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, okay.
Yes.
Virginia had an eastern state, I think it's been closed.
Well, that was a
Okay.
middle house.
That was in Menlo.
Okay.
This one is very famous for its wagon wheel design, but all of the prisoners are kept in solitary confinement. They're let outside by themselves. If they were ever moved through the space where other prisoners would be, a hood would be put over their head. And the idea is that they're forced to kind of reflect on their bad behavior, and this eye of God is always in their cell, and they're totally isolated and forced to be hidden. It's now a tourist attraction. There's actually an artist colony there. This is a very famous photo. This is how Al Capone decorated his cell while he was there. I think he got special treatment. But that eye of God is said to have driven very many people crazy. Charles Dickens visited the United States, came to see Niagara Falls in the Eastern State Penitentiary. Sounds like a great trip. He later wrote, "The system is rigid, strict, hopeless solitary confinement. I believe it and expects to be cruel and wrong." De Tocqueville, when he visited the United States, also went there, thought it was great. So, but the oculus in this experiment seemed to be crazy making. The person I really wanted to focus on with this talk, and when Sandy asked me about it, this retrospective was going on at the Guggenheim. There were corresponding, or exhibition was going on at the Guggenheim. There were corresponding retrospectives going on at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Houston and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in California. The exhibition is actually still going on at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. But this is the work of James Turrell, and this is an artist who began working with light in the 1960s. He states that he makes spaces that apprehend light for our perception, and in some ways gather it or seem to hold on to it. So he's very much about light. And in this work at the Guggenheim, he's taken this famous Frank Lloyd Wright design, and instead of focusing on the exhibition areas, he's focusing on this giant void in the middle of the Guggenheim Museum. And it becomes quite mesmerizing, and there's plenty of photographs of people kind of laying around on the floor and kind of just experiencing the phenomenon as colors change and values differ. So it's just quite visually stunning. He states that his work has no object, no imagery, no focus, and with no object, image, or focus, what are you looking at? You're looking at looking. What is important to me is create the experience of wordless thought. Or I think for some it might be referred to as awe. He also designed this space, which is a Quaker meeting house in Houston, Texas. He was actually raised as a Quaker, and he talked about his grandmother's explanations of what that meant, and he stated that her explanation was that you went inside to greet the light when you went to the meeting. And this idea, to go inside and find the light within, literally as well as figuratively, was something that really propelled me at the time. I really thought that's what I should do. Of course, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what she meant. But this oculus, he wouldn't call it an oculus, he called it a sky space, but this opening in the ceiling changes over time. And the light inside of the space changes over time. And so the sensation is quite visually moving, and I believe they open up this meeting house Fridays at sunset for the public to come in. States that he's always been interested in the limits of inside inside-outside dyad. Or Joseph Campbell talked about the sacred versus the mundane. Again, we have this binary relationship. And artists are good at trying to rectify those, I think. At Rice University, also in Houston, the motto of Rice University is unconventional wisdom. And this piece is in the middle of the campus. It's one of his sky space pieces. And just terribly wonderful space for people to gather. When the lights are yellow, the sun's going down at night, you'll see this. Middle of the day, you might see this. It's quite powerful. His largest work, and maybe the one that deserves the most focus, is Rudel Crater. It's located in Arizona. Joseph Campbell notes that people claim the land by creating sacred sites. They invest the land with spiritual powers. In 1974, and maybe a couple of years prior, James Turrell spent a lot of time in his personal aircraft flying around looking for an appropriate site where he could make this massive work of art. This is a drawing from 1988 where he kind of outlined his plans for how this crater would be engineered to effectively perform the monumental visual phenomenon he hoped for it to embody. He said when it's finished, from 20 different chambers and tunnels, a viewer could look down a tunnel, look out an aperture, and look at the sun, the moon, the stars, and find these experiences that are acoustically tuned as if on inside of a flute. There is a Friends of Rudel Crater website if you're so inclined to donate money. As he states, I hope it will be open in our lifetime. It actually physically exists right now in wonderful form, though not regarded as completed just yet. Google map it. There we go. And you get a sense of the immensity and the gesture of the land. And when you get there, you'll see these openings in the ground. And you can go inside. And if you get to the top of that staircase and you start to look in, I mean, the way that our relationship with the heaven and the earth is reconfigured is just extremely powerful. As the project has continued to unfold and different support has gotten behind it, the plans have changed, and I think more interior life has become part of the design. This is kind of the central, called the sun and moon chamber. He states that he's totally involved in the sky. We make very clear the main thing that I'm totally interested in is space and not form. Thank you very much.
We have a little time for a question, or if you're like me and just done thinking about stuff, you might need a moment of silence. Any questions for either Mr. Rudel or Dr. Emmanuel?
Had you had a chance to visit many of these last places you showed us?
No, I've never been to Rodin Crater. I'm not sure it's close to anything,
Okay. Just out there.
but I'd like to.
Yeah.
In your research about Eastern State Penitentiary, was it mentioned that the first penitentiary was designed after the monasteries? And was there any insight given to if these people were people of faith, how would the concept of a monastery be brought to them?
I really, most of what I focus on is just the oculus as a tool for communicating the idea of
If
the
a person isn't a faithful person, they won't understand the concept of meditation, contemplation, or a monastery, and the intention to be closer to God.
I assume there were people there preaching to
Any other questions? Last words, then? That was quite wonderful. Thank you both very much. Would you join me in thanking them? Our job is complete. You have something to think about the rest of the day.